Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, let's revisit just how historically good, that's right, historically good this Timberwolves defense is. I also want to look at the Wolves offense post-Cat injury, another check-in on that. We'll also predict the schedule here the rest of the year. It's all upcoming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's show is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use the code, all lowercase, LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Happy Tuesday, everybody. Lots to get to today. I want to revisit how historically good this Timberwolves defense is. There's some important context here. We haven't talked about this in a couple of months, and we're coming down to the home stretch. I think it's time we revisit it. I also want to look at the post Karl-Anthony Towns injury offense for the Wolves and peek ahead at the schedule here within the last, like I said, home stretch, like 3-ish weeks of the regular season. So lots to get to. Without further ado, a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Also want to remind you about the postcasts. Not only do we cover the Wolves every day, but we also give you instant episodes after every single game. Check out the Locked On Wolves postcast right here on the Locked On Wolves podcast feed, as well as streaming live after each game on the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel. Get rapid reaction to all the biggest moments with the Locked On Wolves postcast. You can join our guys, Luke Inman, and usually Jack Borman, occasionally Tyler Metcalf from Canis after each and every Wolves game. All right. Lots to get to today. I want to start with the defense. And the Wolves have had the best defense in the league virtually all season long, and it hasn't been close. And I don't think that's news to anyone listening or watching this podcast, but I think it's important to talk about the context for just how dominant this defense is. And no, compared to defenses from 10 years ago, from 5 years ago, especially 12, 20 years ago. Yeah, the defensive rating, the points per game, all that stuff is not as good because of the way the game has changed, right? The type of shots teams are shooting, the premium placed on three-pointers and free throws, pace, obviously rating adjusts for that to an extent. But offenses are just far more efficient now than they were at any other point in the history of the league. And so context matters. So I'm not going to, I don't know, you go to some random fan and they would tell you like, oh, the defense of the 90s, points per game, blah, blah, blah. That's not how we're going to measure defense, right? We're going to measure by defensive rating. And more importantly, in my opinion, context, which is each individual season. Because again, offenses overall are more efficient and just better now. So the Wolves right now, and we did talk about this, I don't know, probably mid-January, maybe late January was the last time that I've really kind of revisited this conversation. This Timberwolves defense is 2.9 points better than the next best defense league-wide. And that's defensive rating, and I'm using cleaning the glass. I should say that. Cleaning the glass eliminates garbage time. It eliminates heave possessions at the end of quarters. So it is going to be a little bit, I'd say, more accurate than Basketball Reference. And no matter how you slice it, they're the best defense on Basketball Reference too, because it's not close. They are 2.9 points per 100 possessions better than the Orlando Magic, who have gotten all the way up to number 2. They've been playing really well lately. Cleveland is number 3. Boston's number 4. Cleveland and Boston have mostly been in the top 5. Boston has all season. Cleveland got there after the first of the year, and they've slipped a little recently. Oklahoma City's fallen down to 6th defensively. Okay, so the Wolves are number 1 108.7 points per 100 possessions, 2.9 points per 100 possessions. This is through play on Sunday, excuse me. 2.9 points per 100 possessions better than the next best defense. The data on cleaning the glass goes back 20 seasons to the 2003-2004 season. Of course, hopefully, ironically, bookending, the last time the Wolves bookending lots of years of futility. The last time and the only time the Wolves have ever won a playoff series, and yes, they won 2 in 2004, the KG MVP season. That's the first season of data on cleaning the glass. In the last 20 years, there's only been one team that's had a defense with a gap like that over the league's second best defense. Only one time. And by the way, there's no other years that are close to where the Wolves are this year, besides the one time when a team had a better lead or a bigger lead over the second best defense. That was the San Antonio Spurs in the 2015-16 season. So going back 8 years, they had a 3.1 point per 100 possession lead over the second best defense of the league. So only a slight, 3.1, the Wolves are 2.9. The next best is a 2.2 point lead. And only 2 other times total has there been the number one defense that's had a gap of 2 or more points better per 100 possessions than the next best defense. So 3 times, or if you include the Wolves this year, 4 times in 20 years, has there been a gap of greater than 2 points. And this year's Wolves team is currently number 2. By the way, those other ones, Milwaukee in the 1920, the first COVID truncated season, the bubble season, Milwaukee had a 2.2 point per 100 possession lead over the number 2 team. In Boston, the KG year, 2007-2008, had a 2.1 point lead. Again, Wolves 2.9. That's significant. It really is. The second best defense, if you're comparing it to the league's second best defense in each of these years, in the last 20 years. And there's still a shot, albeit an outside one, that they expand that even more. And we'll talk about the schedule later, but the Wolves don't play. Well, we can talk a little bit about it now. The Wolves only play 5 more defenses that are currently in the top 10. They have what? Let's see. 3, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. They have 12 games left. The Wolves do. 11 games left. They play 5 more top 10 defenses. Denver twice, Phoenix twice, and who's the other one? Who else is a top 10? Somebody else in there. Oh, Atlanta does. Atlanta's a top 10 offense. So they have 5 more top 10 offenses, and most of the rest of them are in the bottom 10. So an outside shot the Wolves have at catching that margin that the 2016 Spurs had over the second best defense in the league that year. So it is historically significant how good this Wolves defense has been. Another note on this, they've been good without Rudy on the floor too. Obviously, they've been better with Rudy, and Rudy's on-off numbers are great defensively because he is great defensively. But if you take him off the court, the Wolves still have a defense that's in the 86th percentile league-wide and all their lineups together without Rudy Gobert, according to Clean the Glass. They're allowing a 111.4 points per 100 possessions, which, again, let me give some context there. If I can find where my list went here. The overall league-wide, here we go, 111, what did I say? 111.7. Goodness, I have too many Clean the Glass tabs open. 111.4 is the points per 100 possessions with no Rudy on the floor. That would clock in as the second best defense in the league, behind only the Wolves. So take Rudy out of the equation entirely, which is absurd, but pretend Rudy doesn't exist this season. And in the minutes that Rudy's not on the floor, the Wolves would still have the league's best defense by defensive rating at Cleaning the Glass. It'd be 0.2 points per 100 possessions better than Orlando. And that, if nothing else, illustrates the gap between the Wolves defense and the league's next best defense this season. How crazy is that? Without the, at odds-on favorite for defensive player of the year, the Wolves still have the league's best defense in non-Rudy minutes this year. And obviously it's a relatively small sample, but I mean, he just missed 3 straight games. The Wolves went 2-1 in those games. Granted, their 2 wins were over Utah, but we're still talking about 2,300 possessions this year without Rudy on the floor. And this Wolves team would still have the best defensive rating in the entire league. It's so crazy. All right. I want to talk a little bit about, speaking of recent trends for the Wolves, I want to talk about the Wolves since Karl-Anthony Towns went down with the meniscus injury, their obviously overall record, but also where the offense is trending and comparing that to where I thought it would trend and what still needs to happen for the Wolves this year. We'll close by looking ahead at the schedule, the final 11 games, my prediction for how the Wolves will close the season based on the schedule. It's all upcoming here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors at Prize Picks. Prize Picks is America's #1 fantasy sports app with over 3 million members. They are the easiest and most exciting way to play DFS. It's just you against the numbers. You pick more than or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch your winnings roll in. It's demon time on Prize Picks. You can now win up to 100 times your money with as little as 4 correct picks. You can turn $10 into $1,000. Demons and Goblins are the newest and most exciting way to play at Prize Picks. Squares marked with red demons or green goblins get you different payouts. You can now win up to 100 times your money with as little as 4 correct picks. You can also play alongside some of Prize Picks' favorite players like rapper Meek Mill or comedian Andrew Schultz. You can find community plays under the promos tab of the app to view entries from some of the biggest names in the Prize Picks community each week. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use the code LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA, code LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks, pick more, pick less. It's that easy. Do you watch Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? And if so, do you have to turn down the volume with all the shouting? I'm sure you do. If you watch Fox Sports or ESPN, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Simply make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right. We talked defense. Let's talk a little bit of offense. And the Timberwolves overall since the Karl-Anthony Towns injury. So going back to March 7th was that game against the Pacers right after the Wolves announced the injury to Cat. The Timberwolves are 6-3 during that stretch. It's notable that they also missed Rudy Gobert for 3 games during that stretch. They also missed Kyle Anderson and Monte Morris for multiple games each during that stretch. And yet they've still managed to go 6-3. Their only losses being that overtime loss to Cleveland with the Rudy Gobert money sign. The Lakers loss, which was fairly ugly. And then the Denver loss, which they very well could have won. I mean, come on. Like, I get it. Like, they've also won actually, no, not really. They've only won a couple of close games. You could count the Golden State game. I guess I would. And then the Pacers game with the crazy ant block. So I guess we could play that game all day because there's 2 games they easily could have lost. There's 2 games that they lost they easily could have won, the Cavs game and the Denver game. But the not moral of the story, but the summary here is they're 6-3 in games without Karl-Anthony Towns. And digging a bit deeper, they haven't been worse significantly on either end of the floor during this period of time. They've been better offensively. Their defense over the stretch has been 10th. And again, no Rudy for 3 of those games. So they're 10th in defense since Cat went out. Again, still easily number 1 in the league. And they're 13th in offense, which for the year, you know, you're still talking about a team that's what? I think they're up to 16th. Yeah, they're 16th currently, by the way, on cleaning the glass. So they're improving offensively. I've been saying I thought they're not going to get to top 12 anymore, but I had been saying I thought they should be a top half offense and hopefully top 12 by the end of the season. They're up to 16 for the year. And again, they're 13th in offensive rating, 116.2 points per 100 possessions, 13th in the league since the Cat injury over 9 games. Overall, they've got the league's 13th net rating, 13th ranked net rating during that period of time, and, you know, have generally played really well. Digging a bit further, offensively, what I said the Wolves needed to do was they needed to play faster and they needed to shoot more threes. Well, they've done one of those 2 things. They've played faster. They certainly have. They're not necessarily shooting any more threes, although, I mean, they shot what, 52.5%? I think they were 21 of 40 from 3 in their win the other night. I mean, that'll play. Like, if you make over 50% of your threes, you'll be fine. Now they only won by 4, but in general, that's obviously a positive trend. Let's talk about pace of play first, though. The Wolves for the season, They're actually up, like if you look at the basketball reference pace number, they're up to 24th in pace. They were 29th for a really long time. But if you look at the Wolves and how often they operate in transition, for the season, they're 29th in transition, in frequency of transition, offensive transition plays. Okay. Only 12.8% of the time where they get out in transition. And I talked about this at length, but they are number one in terms of efficiency. So they're second to last in frequency. They were last for a long time, and they're first in efficiency. Off of steals, they're 21st. They are still just 30th in terms of running off of live defensive rebounds for the season. They're 30th. Off of live defensive rebounds for the season, they just run 21% of the time, 21.1% of the time. Since the Cat injury, though, they're 23rd in running off of live rebounds, which is about 24% of the time. They're still 21st in running off of steals, but their overall transition frequency is up to 18th in the league over the last 9 games since Cat got hurt, a 13.6% of the time. So they're running, it's only 1% more of the time. It's once or twice more per game is what that amounts to. But when you're scoring at a rate of 135 points per 100 transition plays, you're averaging more than a point per game in transition added since Cat went out. That's how the math checks out here. Somewhere between 1 and 2 points per game more you're scoring because you're playing faster. And trust me, I believe Chris Finch wants them to play even faster. Remember how fast they played in the first year plus under Chris Finch? And now with Rudy Gobert and with the multiple big lineup and Ant being so good in isolation and in the half court overall, of course you're going to play a little bit slower. But without Cat, and I'll summarize this because I've said it so much on the show, but the cliff notes are play a higher variance game, especially with athletes and shooters like the Wolves have. Even without Karl-Anthony Towns, they've got a bunch of guys that can shoot on this team. And after their insane display of shooting against the Warriors the other night, the Wolves are now up to second in the league in three-point shooting percentage, shooting 39% from three. So the second piece of this is it's very encouraging that they're running more, yes. And that also, by the way, should lead to more open threes in transition, whether it's pushing it to the corners, having guys sprint to the corners or trail threes for guys like Nas. They should get more threes out of just running more often. But the second piece of this is just shoot more threes, period. I know they're missing their best three-point shooter in Karl-Anthony Towns, but Conley is still 43%, which is actually a little higher than Cat this year. Nas is 42%. Monte Morris in a Wolves uniform is shooting 42% from three now, 41.7%. Nickeil Alexander-Walker, 38%. Ant is the worst three-point shooter besides Jaden McDaniels and obviously besides Rudy Gobert. And I guess obviously besides Kyle Anderson. But of that whole group of guys, right, you talk about all the guys who would shoot threes, so take out Gobert. And Ant's like the worst three-point shooter besides Jaden McDaniels, and yet he's the highest volume guy. And that's fine. I'm not saying he should shoot less threes. I'm actually saying I'd be fine with him shooting more. The point is he's league average. He's 37% from three with unlimited range, and he's a volume three-point shooter. Everybody else is above league average from outside the arc that's in this rotation. They've got spacing. It's just a matter of not ending up with too many lineups, too many minutes with Slow-Mo and Gobert on the floor, or Slow-Mo, Gobert, and Jaden McDaniels on the floor. Right? And that's also why we're seeing Jordan McLaughlin playing a little bit more, even though they have a full rotation. And now 3 of the guys in their 9-man rotation are point guards. But McLaughlin shot so well from 3, and he doesn't turn it over. It's more about spacing than anything else at this point. And also the Wolves' issues with turning the ball over. Right? So it makes sense that Chris Finch is finding minutes for Jordan McLaughlin between the lack of turnovers that he generates and the as hot as he's been from outside the arc. You can't have these multiple lineups where it's, 4 of your 4 worst three-point shooters on the floor at the same time that are part of the rotation. Doesn't make sense, right? So they are playing faster without Karl-Anthony Towns, and it has gotten them somewhere between a point and 2. The math's a little fuzzy, but it checks out. Trust me. They're running on average at least one more transition play per game, and they're scoring 135 or so points per 100 possessions in transition on the season. So they're going to score more points by running more often, and they have been doing all of that since Cat got hurt. So again, 13th in offense over the last 9 games. They've increased their transition frequency to 18th in the league from what for the season has been 29th in the league. All positive trends for the Wolves, and it should lead to more three-point opportunities and hopefully more free throw opportunities as well, which is another thing that for the year is fine. Like they're 8th in the league in offensive free throw rate. Actually 6th in the league in offensive free throw rate. But lately they've been getting out free throwed because they've been fouling so much on the other end of the floor. But all that to say, positive trends offensively for Minnesota. And given some of the upcoming opponents, there's more opportunity for the Wolves to be more efficient offensively, even without Karl-Anthony Towns in the lineup. Speaking of the upcoming schedule, I want to take a peek at it, give my prediction for the rest of the season as the Wolves. The rest isn't great, but the schedule's not all too bad for Minnesota here to close out the year. We'll get to all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by BetterHelp. It's sponsored by BetterHelp. Sometimes we all need the opportunity to get something off our chest, big or small. Certain things can really start to get to you, and it's important to let that out, especially to someone who might be unbiased on your life. So today, I want to say how I really feel about something, and you're listening to this Wolves podcast. You may be thinking about the same thing. I also want to acknowledge it may seem trivial, but whatever's bugging you, like, hey, we all have the right to try and get whatever it is off our chest. For me today, this week, it is that more attention isn't being paid. It often comes back to the national attention, right? And I promise it's not like an inferiority complex for somebody who covers the Wolves or somebody who's from Minnesota, right? But there is something there, right? Like the Wolves, for them to be 6-3 against the competition they've faced without Karl-Anthony Towns is very impressive. In fact, everyone they've played, except for Utah, since Cat's been hurt, is a playoff team, or at least a play-in team. And Utah's not a bad home team. The Wolves beat them twice in Utah. Yes, some guys missed one of those games, whatever, but you could say that about almost any game this year. And not only that, they took Denver and Cleveland to the wire. It hasn't been pretty at times, but as we've already talked about, the offense has been better. The defense has more than held serve, and people aren't paying enough attention to, as we talked about in the first segment, how historically great the Wolves defense is. And also that goes to another one of these, like Chris Finch. Like, let's talk more about how good Chris Finch has been this season. Plenty of things to get off my chest, obviously. And hey, look, most of us have bigger problems than our favorite sports team, but it's important to get things off your chest every once in a while. And surely therapy can be different for everyone. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be flexible and suited to your schedule. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. All right, the Wolves only have 11 games left in the regular season, as hard as that is to believe. But here we are, 11 games left. And it's a bit of a feast or famine. Maybe not the right analogy to use here, but let's say it this way. They're all pretty much good or bad teams. There's very few in the middle. They face Houston. I'd put them in the middle. But, I mean, they have Detroit. I guess Atlanta's kind of in the middle. But they have Detroit. They have Washington. They have Toronto. They have the Bulls. And then they have Denver twice. They have Phoenix twice. They have the Lakers. So it's a tricky end of season schedule. And also, part of the reason why I'm doing more of the big picture stuff today and revisiting some of the topics I covered a couple of months ago related to the Wolves defense and then also the post-Cat injury offense is because this is the last 2-day break the Wolves have in the regular season. They take on Detroit Wednesday, day off Denver, day off Chicago, day off Houston. That's the first night of a back-to-back. Then a 1 day off, 1 day off, 1 day off, another back-to-back, and then 2 more 1-day breaks. So no more 2-day breaks the rest of the season for Minnesota. They've got 11 games, over the next 3.5 weeks. I think 3 weeks from Sunday is their last, 2 weeks from Sunday, or last 2.5 weeks of the season, 11 games. And then that's it for the regular season. So next up, the Wolves have Detroit on Wednesday. We'll do a full preview of that game on tomorrow's show, on Wednesday's show. The Wolves have not seen the Pistons since January 17th, and that was a win at Detroit, a bit of a touch-and-go game. Again, we'll talk more about that Wednesday, but the Wolves won that one by 7. So Detroit on Wednesday, which is the last game of a 4-game homestand that's gone well, the close loss to Denver, and then wins over Cleveland and Golden State. So obviously, I hate to say must win, but a game they really need to win on Wednesday against Detroit. Then the old 1-game road trip at Denver on Friday, which is going to be real tough, popping into play at altitude against the Nuggets, and then home for a 3-game homestand that they really should sweep: Chicago, Houston, Toronto. It's about as easy of a homestand as it gets, although Houston's been playing great lately, so certainly don't want to overlook that at all. I mean, a bit surprising given the injury concerns that they've had, right? But anyway, that's that next homestand. So 3 games they should win. And then at Phoenix. Oh, by the way, there's a back-to-back in there. Houston, Toronto's a back-to-back. And, of course, the Wolves lost to Toronto in the season opener. Then they go to Phoenix, to the Lakers, home for Washington, another 1-game homestand. And that's a home road back-to-back, the second night of that back-to-back at Denver on national TV. They close with a pair of home games against Atlanta and Phoenix. So, overall, like, the back-to-back at Denver is a likely loss. You figure they probably split the games against Phoenix. It's a tough matchup, and we'll talk more about that later. They haven't seen Phoenix since that back-to-back loss in, I believe it was early November. It was really brutal, but weirdly, haven't seen them since. So you figure they probably split the Phoenix games. They probably lose the Denver game. And, between Denver and at LA, maybe they lose one of those. I don't know. I don't see more than 3 losses here. I mean, this team should really finish the year 8-3. That's what I had going through this. They're not going to lose all 4 games to Denver and Phoenix. Like, say they split those 4. Say it that way. They split those 4. That allows them to lose 1 more game. So is your loss to Detroit? Probably not. Chicago, maybe they lost to them once. Could be Houston, Toronto, the Lakers on the road, Atlanta, Phoenix, the Wizards. So I think they go 8-3, at worst 7-4. And honestly, that would be a fine close to the season. If the Wolves finished here with 56 wins, knowing that Karl-Anthony Towns didn't play in the final 5 weeks of the regular season, that wouldn't be bad at all. And by the way, they're 6-3 post-cat injury. Say they go 7-4 and close this year 13-7 without Karl-Anthony Towns. That's not bad. That's not a bad final 20. It really isn't. And, of course, at this point, it'd be surprising if Cat played in the first round of the playoffs. But I would say it's realistic. It sounds like that he could make an appearance in the second round. So, sitting here right now, like looking at the standings, feels unlikely that the Wolves will get the number 1 seed in the West, but they're only a game and a half back from Denver, and they still have the chance to win that tiebreaker if they do somehow find a way to win those last 2, but at least split them so they don't lose the tiebreaker. They actually have a better division record, which is, I believe, the next tiebreaker, and a better conference record. So if they split, if they win this game, both are in Denver, and one's on a back-to-back. But if they can find a way to split those 2, same thing with Oklahoma City. The Wolves have the tiebreaker currently against Oklahoma City, and the head-to-head tiebreaker is tied. So if they can tie with Denver, they would hold the 3-way tiebreaker over Denver and Oklahoma City, and would get the 1 seed. But as it sits right now, they're 4.5 games clear of the Clippers for the 3 spot. So it's very, very likely the Wolves end up with the top 3 seed. They're currently 3, a half game behind OKC and 1.5 behind Denver as of recording this podcast late on Monday. And neither team is playing on Monday, unless I'm crazy and I'm reading this wrong. But I don't think Denver and OKC are both off as well. And of course, OKC had a rough loss. What did they lose to on Sunday? Oh, the Bucks. They got blown out at Milwaukee, and they've got the Pelicans, by the way, on Tuesday night. So, and that's the front end of a back-to-back. They don't actually have the easiest schedule down the stretch. They've got the Suns, they've got at the Knicks, at the Sixers, at the Celtics, at the Pacers. OKC's got a 5-game road trip there, and they finish with 4 at home. But a couple of those are the Bucks, Kings, and Mavs. So the Thunder have a tougher closing schedule than Minnesota. I'm not going to pull the whole Nuggets schedule, but I think I don't want to say likely. Right now, my prediction is the Wolves finish second in the West. And they go, we'll call it 8-3 over the final 11 games. All right. That's all we have for you today. Of course, Wednesday, we'll get into a couple additional topics. We'll also preview that Pistons game on Wednesday night. And, of course, we'll have the live postcast following Wolves Pistons on Wednesday and the postgame pod on Thursday. A light week of games for the Wolves. But, again, no more 2-day breaks through the rest of the regular season. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV, and you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. A reminder that the Locked On Sports has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. It's also available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now available on the free Fire TV channels app. Reminder that the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.